Welcome to the Rights Track podcast, where we aim to get the hard facts about the human rights challenges facing us today. I'm Todd Landman. Today's episode is the last episode in the first series of the Rights Track. We're focusing on human rights in America through the lens of race. My first guest is Christopher Phelps, who is Associate Professor of American Studies at the University of Nottingham. He is author of Radicals in America, the U.S. Left Since the Second World War with Cambridge University Press, and editor of Race and Revolution with Verso Books. My second guest is Karen Salt, co-director of the Center for Research in Race and Rights at the University of Nottingham. Karen is a scholar of race, sovereignty, power, and politics, and looks in particular at how those issues intersect in the Caribbean and the African diaspora. She is the director of the first Black Studies PhD program in Europe, and she is an author of Unfinished Revolution with Liverpool University Press. It's great to have you both here, and typically we do these podcasts with people all over the world, and it's really nice to have a face-to-face chat for our final episode in the first series. And given everything that's been going on in 2016, I was very keen to make sure that we spent some time talking about the United States of America. And over the years, I've written pieces about violence in America, and particularly around shootings, the Michael Brown shooting, and many others. And I've tried to make the statistical case that there is a kind of a typicality of the cases like Michael Brown, that he very much falls on the line of the statistical analysis, that it's a very typical case, he's a typical victim, and that the statistics really do reveal a disproportionality of treatment against particular communities in America, and in particular the African American community. I wrote another piece for Open Democracy around the need, perhaps, for the United States to found what's called a Truth Commission, and modeling itself on some of the commissions like were had in South Africa and Peru, Sierra Leone, and East Timor. I thought it would be really interesting if the United States just paused for 3 years or more to spend time analyzing some of the main underlying problems in American society, that kind of epidemiology of violence, for example, good, strong statistical studies on disproportionality of treatment of different groups in society, police violence as well as gun violence, but also extrajudicial killings and sentencing, the judicial system in general. And this would be a moment of reflection where we look at some of those underlying patterns, but also invite people to give public hearings, public discourses, and statements about what they experience in American society, some in-depth case studies, etc. And all those methods of analysis had been used in truth commissions around the world, and I thought it would be a great time for the U.S. to do that. And lo and behold, I find that the UN has also published a report which reaches a very similar conclusion. This is a report of the Working Group on People of African Descent, and it made a visit to the United States and produced this report. And the recommendation, 88, they say that there should be, after they made this visit, a National Human Rights Commission in accordance with the principles relating to the status of national institutions for the promotion and protection of human rights, and that the government should establish within this body a specific division to monitor the human rights of African Americans. So that's what I thought we would kind of use to frame our discussions on this episode of the Rights Track. And I'm going to start with Karen Salt to have a few reflections about what I've just said there, and then we'll carry on from there.
Yes, I think it's interesting, this moment. What you've been working on quite specifically, and I think what you've been struggling with, is trying to figure out what sort of discourse needs to happen in public. What are the ways that people need to sort of work through and think about various different ideas and various different problems. In some ways, we're talking about these hauntings of the past that sort of pervade the present, not only within sort of infrastructures and institutions, but the kind of day-to-day stuff. I mean, here in the UK, for example, we know that there were huge spikes after the EU referendum, for example, in incidences of race-based hate crimes, to the point where there is now actually going to be massive investigation into this. But there was a lot of actual, just fairly simple things of people walking down the street and people yelling at people on tubes and on buses, and a type of behavior that we also see online in terms of just vitriolic kind of language. So there's almost a question of, yes, let's have a commission, but it's also how do we reshape the way we talk to each other about this set of issues and problematics. I've got a project that's funded by the Research Councils UK and a few other places it's called the Trust Map. And one of the things that we're interested in the formation and loss of trust in minority communities in the UK. But we're interested in what we're calling reparative trust. What are the things that you need to do from a policy perspective all the way through to just kind of, thinking about community cohesion to repair relationships?
So is this loss of trust within the community or between communities and different communities?
It's loss of trust between communities, but we're really quite specifically interested between communities and those entities that are in charge of things. So this could be your local authority, your mayor, your council, the police even. And often we think what we need is we just need, better services. We need people to show up when they say they're going to. We need to fix the streets. We need to deal with the potholes. And not to belittle the notion of a commission, but, we need to have a commission. But it's also, how do we repair a set of, in a long-term process? And so how do we follow on from a commission to then do the sort of really much harder work, which is sort of rebuild sets of relationships between sets of people?
So I can hear skeptics lining up about the need for a commission and what it might achieve. And President Obama had a commission, the Presidential Commission into Police Violence, and there was a report that talked about police reform and what could be done, et cetera, et cetera. And actually the Dallas police were sort of raised as an exemplar of beginning to build the kind of trust you're talking about, community relations, et cetera. And yet this is where there's a shooting of police officers by a lone shooter. So it's a really interesting set of tensions there around the need for all these things, the need for the discourse, things actually happening within particular communities, and yet we see this violence meted out on the street, even though all these things are happening.
Absolutely, because I think we're talking about sets of relationships that are not just solved by panaceas, right? They're not solved by Band-Aids, they're not solved by voting the first person of African descent into the presidential office, right? That doesn't just solve hundreds and hundreds of years of particular sets of relationships, or a situation where you actually have the encoding of law of disenfranchisement of sets of people, much less the fact that the groups of people aren't even considered as humans. When you have that as your reality of a historical sets of encounters and political conditions, the notion that people would imagine that Barack Obama would become president and suddenly all that history not only just goes away, but as if it's just suddenly healed. Like it's just done, is just a bit ridiculous, actually. Not only because I think it puts an enormous amount of pressure on him to suddenly go around to be the shiny black president and touch things, and suddenly everything becomes the shiny black thing everywhere, which is just ludicrous, right? It's just ludicrous.
Right.
And puts undue pressure, I think, on him as a president in terms of just being a politician. And I have respect for politicians, but I have an immense amount of doubt about politicians. And that should be a fair critique of everybody, that they are politicians. But instead, he has to kind of marshal around and be this kind of Moses politician in a way that is just sort of like, that's a lot of pressure on a person in a political machine that we probably would love to be as democratic as it possibly can, but also has a lot of problems with some of that.
Yeah, and I think, one of the reactions to the Obama presidency is that there was a tremendous amount of expectation heaped upon his shoulders
totally.
When he took office.
Yeah, and that the voters voting him in suddenly made the country post-racial.
Yeah.
So that therefore we have broken down all these sort of barriers and all this sort of language and terminology of difference, and how that difference has been encoded in sort of sets of relationships and the institutionalization of sort of sets of people. And you're like, well, I'm not sure about that.
Right.
And so now we've got volumes being written after the volumes that were written about the post-racial America. Now new volumes are written that Obama didn't do anything. Why didn't he change things? And ultimately we still have a prison industrial complex, and we still have these other issues. And it's like, well, okay, what would the presidency have done to shift all of that?
To make that difference.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I really like the notion of what you've described as both a reckoning with actual statistics and actual information, but also the value of testimonials.
Yes.
The value of actually bringing people to come forward and tell their stories. That is not necessarily about quantifying or measuring or representation or trying to get exact numbers, but is actually saying we value all the knowledges and the experiences that people have, and we want to weave that into a narrative and a story about ourselves in a way that we can understand what it is that we've all been living. What is our lived theory in a certain way?
What's the lived theory? Do we bear witness to these things?
Exactly.
I want to turn to Christopher now, because Karen had made this comment about these things been going on for hundreds of years, encoded, embedded, etc. And as an historian, this might really resonate with you, because really there's nothing new under the sun here, in a sense. And there was an official from the Trump campaign in Ohio who said there was no racism in America until Obama was elected president. And, that statement in and of itself is so extraordinary to hear in this day and age. I wonder if you might just reflect on everything we've been saying, and in particular that kind of bizarre quote.
Yeah, I think that you had several centuries of slavery, followed by a full century of Jim Crow racial segregation, and then there's the difficulty, which Karen's comments are getting at, of trying to make heads or tails of precisely where we now stand. On the one hand, the country has come far enough to elect a black president, and in its civil rights laws is light years ahead of where it was, say, in 1950. But on the other hand, there's deep-seated structural inequality, and there is flourishing in this very year of kind of flagrant racism in political discourse of the kind that we thought we were beyond to some extent. And so I keep in my mind wondering about this idea of yours about a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I'm thinking about it as a historian. I'm thinking of past such commissions. Actually, there was a Kerner Commission that famously, at the end of the 60s riots, Watts and all of those epic urban upheavals of the 60s said that there are two nations separate and unequal, which was shocking to some white Americans who somehow thought that had been solved with Brown versus Board of Education or something like that. But if we had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission now, my sense is it might perform a really useful role in terms of information gathering, because one problem in the United States is there's no kind of national databases. It took the Guardian newspaper to chart exactly how many African American victims of police violence there were in the course of a year, and they had to put immense investigative resources and have reporters devoted full time to it. And how paradoxical that it's a British newspaper deciding to make that a news priority rather than the federal government having any kind of accessible records on this. And that's not accidental, because there's the National Rifle Association. It doesn't want any research on gun violence, period, whether it's by police or by citizens, and they block it politically. So where I'm going with this is that I can see it playing a useful information gathering role and discursive role in people learning how to discuss these things maybe in a more constructive way. But I worry that perhaps the Truth and Reconciliation process in South Africa happened because there was a revolution and because white South Africans had to come clean and be a bit honest about the nature of their history. And I wonder if the dynamics are the same in American society right now, or if we don't have such a powerful right that it would kind of obstruct the usefulness of it ultimately and undermine it and sabotage it in ways that would actually possibly be disastrous for its intentions.
So you used the word revolution, which I would query, because in the South African case, it was a presidential decision to release Nelson Mandela from prison, which then led to a kind of social mobilization around democratic transition, but it certainly wasn't a full-scale social revolution. There was displacement of apartheid, and there was a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was a vehicle, if you will, to come to terms with the past. And one of the sort of downsides of the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission is there was a lot of truth but not much reconciliation. There was everybody was kind of we recognize that something terrible has happened, and there is a criticism out there for these processes that's precisely what happens. They're kind of disappointing and unsatisfying, when today there's still contestation over the Peruvian example and whether we got was the number right in terms of who did what to whom, etc. What were there any reparations? Do people feel any better? Was anyone put in prison for what happened? All those big questions, and that would hit the American case. But I want to go back to the American case, and I want to use reference to the Watts Commission. There was also a Truth Commission in Greensboro, South Carolina, which I reference in the article on Truth Commission. But just before I became a student at the University of Pennsylvania, there was a group called MOVE in West Philadelphia, which was a kind of back to Africa separatist movement. And they had a previous violent interaction with the police and the fire service in Philadelphia. And then this time, they were in a house and they were broadcasting information and propaganda with a loudspeaker system. And the black mayor of the city, Wilson Goode, authorized the federal police to drop an incendiary device on top of the house that they had occupied, not knowing that the house was rigged with petrol bombs. So 60 row houses in West Philadelphia burned down as a result of this decision. There's then a commission, and in the end, Wilson Goode is reelected, right? So, and it's such an interesting set of contradictions in that entire story, and some of these official processes and then the outcome. So to get back to your question, what would it be for? I think that's a great question. I do think this public reckoning function can't be underestimated. The fact that President Obama says Congress will not even authorize me to spend money to collect the data we need to understand the problem, right? That's how far we need to travel to be able to do that. to have a formal truth commission that actually says we need now to spend the money to collect the data, that would be great. People are now using proxy measures and other things to try to get at gun violence and how we might be able to study it. So there's a public reckoning function. I think we can't underestimate the discursive bearing witness function either. But then I would be much happier if out of those two processes you then get serious reform and a serious hard look at the institutions in America and the ways in which that is or is not working, and a lot of political science on gerrymandering, districting, the way cities are organized, etc., had basically said this is failure of the liberal order, which means you have these intentionally segregated communities that are then manufactured in ways that produce the sorts of votes that they produce in elections. So there's a whole basket of things there that would need to be looked at.
Yeah, I think we can't underestimate the fact, too, that we've had, this kind of two-nation mentality. I grew up in an area that has a city name, but was nowhere near that city. So it was a kind of intentional, forgotten Black community. And what was kind of interesting about this community, large parts of it were actually quite poor. There were pockets of people who were teachers, or there were a few doctors or a few people who had businesses. But that community had to create a shadow governmental structure for itself. It had to figure out how to govern. It had to figure out how to move resources, and because it could not depend upon the city it was supposedly attached to get any of that, much less representation. Mm-hmm. And so it structurally had to sort of figure out how to function, and actually was fairly good for a very long period of time, from a Lions Club to all sorts of sort of interesting things that erupted, lots of churches. And then drugs came, and then there was various other things, and then there were other sorts of issues. And as time went on, the community, as it was trying to mobilize itself, completely devoid of any infrastructural entity, was grappling with these other sets of issues. And as it caused immense amount of problems, to the point where I typically tell the story that there are a significant amount of young women that I grew up with who are either incarcerated or dead. Where was its statistics of that place be, right? It's not that city that it was supposedly connected to, even though that's supposedly where I lived. But I never really lived in that place. In some ways, that's a different sort of story than the urban story of the sort of ghetto, I think, that many people associated with 60s and 70s, sort of Black communities in the U.S., but it's another type of story. It's not a story of sort of rural Alabama. It's not a story of rural Mississippi, but it's another type of story. That is some of this history. It's not a history where getting voting rights would have solved something. It's not a history where if we would have had a new school, that would have solved everything. Or if we would have just gotten better representation, or if we would have got a Black president, it would have solved everything. That shadow structure, and some of that was definitely due to redlining and the movement of people and the enforcement and the particular sets of structures that brought a group of people of certain economic means together. I think those are things that are replicated in lots of places in the U.S. And now, although things have shifted, and there are, in that area that I grew up in now, political representation, there is now a little bit more incorporation into the other bigger city, there are still people who remember this being the shadow city. And they still operate as if they are living in the shadow city. And they still do believe that they are the pathway. In fact, there's a joke that says if you go to areas that were like mine and find the other Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard, it would typically take you from the areas that I grew up in to another space. So there were thoroughfares to take you from a Black community to someplace else. And ours was done in a reparative kind of move on that other city's part to sort of try to pull that place back in. But it was a journey. It didn't want people to stop.
Yeah.
It didn't want people to buy anything. It didn't want to change the economic structure. It wanted to acknowledge that somebody like Martin Luther King Jr. existed and allow people to get from one area to another. That sort of stuff. How do we create new work out of all of that? Because it was there a number of years ago now, and I don't know what's going to solve it. There are very few businesses. Most of them have left and fled. There are people who would love to get out. I don't think they ever will. They're going to end up being stuck there because of a whole set of reasons and issues. And they're desperate for their children to get out.
Your story reminds me of when I lived in Washington, D.C. I was a graduate student at Georgetown University. And as you know, the geography of Washington, D.C. is a real challenge. It's 85% African American. And yet any tourist who comes to Washington, D.C. is immediately carted into the northwest quadrant where we lived as students at Georgetown. And I found as a student moving about in Georgetown was fine on a bicycle or walking, but if you wanted to get from Georgetown into the center of DC, you had to either take a bus or walk or take a taxi because the metro did not stop in Georgetown. Now that's a very strong infrastructural signal to the community that actually we're going to keep these things segregated, because I know the community in Georgetown was not keen in having the metro pass through there. So the metro misses Georgetown, and I think the next stop you can get off at is Arlington, which is across the Potomac on the other side of the river away from Georgetown. And actually, this is probably anecdotal, and I'm going to take a risk in saying it, but in the morning you had a certain ethnic division within the buses going into Georgetown. In the evening you had a certain ethnic composition going out of Georgetown, right? And I find that that's extraordinarily telling and close to you. But I want to turn again to Christopher, because I want to ask you, this report that's come out from the United Nations has been variously received. Those who think there's no problem in America dismiss it. Others who don't like international bodies and the globalist elite will criticize it as just people meddling in the affairs of the United States. Is there any other historical example where the United Nations has said anything about race in America?
Yes, but before I get to that, let me just comment a bit on what you all have just said, which is, I meant political revolution, in which the black majority are exercising citizenship rights,
yes,
and are electing the highest nation's office holders for once. And in that circumstance, the white power structure, which still remains dominant in South Africa, has to come to terms with its past in a way that shows some remorse and so forth. So there's a humility built into the political transformation that South Africa went through that made possible that Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Whereas in the United States, as Karen has just quite vividly detailed for us, there's structures of social inequality that dovetail with structures of political inequality, so that a lot of black elected leadership is often in pockets trying to manage crisis with inadequate resources. And so then the question is, for such a reconciliation process to occur in the United States, let's face it, what it really takes is white Americans opening their hearts and their minds and listening, and then taking action on the basis of egalitarian principle. And that's a lot to ask at this moment when actually I feel, as a white American in exile, that I'm even more distant from my identity group than I ever was all my life, in terms of what I see their voting preferences are, for example, this year. And so maybe we need it now more than ever because of that, but it also means it's going to be fraught and difficult. And can I just respond to the question about the United Nations, and then you can take forth. But I actually brought along a document called An Appeal to the World, with an exclamation point on it, published by the NAACP. That's the oldest black-led civil rights organization in the United States, which was founded in 1909. We think of the civil rights movement as sort of starting with Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King, but there's actually a long history of advocacy and organization. And the NAACP in 1947, which is 2 years after the founding of the United Nations, put out this pamphlet with several essays in it and an introduction by W.E.B. Du Bois, who had been one of the founders of the NAACP. And the subtitle of it is A Statement on the Denial of Human Rights to Minorities in the Case of Citizens of Negro Descent in the United States of America, and an Appeal to the United Nations for Redress. And in particular, there's a final chapter called The Charter of the United Nations and its Provisions for Human Rights and the Rights of Minorities, and decisions already taken under this charter. Du Bois, in his introduction, says, a discrimination practiced in the United States against her own citizens, and to a large extent a contravention of her own laws, cannot be persisted in without infringing upon the rights of the peoples of the world, and especially on the ideals and work of the United Nations. This question, then, which is without doubt primarily an internal and national question, that is specific to the United States, becomes inevitably an international question, and will in the future become more and more international as the nations draw together. And I would argue, and I suspect Karen would agree as a scholar of African American history, that this is just one of a lineage of organized African American political efforts appealing to universal human rights, and even using international law and international organizations like the United Nations to criticize the practice and the law of the United States in order to transform it. So that what we think of as a civil rights movement often was a human rights movement, and often was explicitly making recourse to international human rights doctrine and organizations. So for the United Nations to do this isn't some kind of internal meddling that's new and outsider stuff. It actually is part of a tradition of African Americans themselves trying to use human rights as a lever to transform the United States in a more democratic direction.
That's a fantastic example, and throughout what you were saying and earlier what we were saying, we talked about Brown v. Board of Education, which we learned as students was a turning point, etc. And during the Jim Crow period, there was this notion that African Americans were legally equal. So the laws were all changed. You now have these rights, you can vote, no problem, etc. But we're socially unequal, and this gap between the legal equality and social inequality and political inequality is actually a mobilizing force. So some of my own work on social movements and citizenship rights makes this argument that the gap between rights in principle, i.e. those things that are guaranteed by states and stated in official documents, etc., and the actual lived experience of people in the practice of those rights, and that gap between those two is very much a mobilizing force for social movements. And the civil rights movement made a very simple claim. The U.S. Constitution says everyone's created equal, and yet we see all these incredible laws in the South that don't allow us to go into restaurants together, etc. So it was a very simple argument. And I remember a case in Colorado when I was yet again a graduate student at Boulder, Colorado, and there was an amendment that was being proposed for the state constitution of Colorado that said if you were dismissed from a job for reasons of sexual orientation, you had no recourse for that dismissal, right? And so it was a very strangely, doubly negatively worded amendment to change the state constitution of Colorado that effectively would have resulted in, if a gay person lost their job, they had no legal recourse. And I remember at the time some of the television campaigns for this amendment, and they used African American people on TV saying, your rights violations are not the same as ours. So they were trying to say there's no equivalence between the civil rights movement and the gay rights movement. And that was the sort of campaign to get this thing passed. In the end, it did pass. It was a referendum, and the governor refused to sign it into law because he said it's unconstitutional. And there was an argument against the governor, Romer at the time, that said, you're just a demagogue, you can't do this. And he said, okay, appeal it to the Supreme Court. And it was, and the Supreme Court said it's unconstitutional, and therefore it did not become law. So, with that little preamble in mind, and that gap between principle and practice as a mobilizing force, I wanted to turn the sort of final part of our discussion to the Black Lives Matter movement. Because in many ways, the Black Lives Matter movement is making also a very simple claim. And I think the claim is being misunderstood and misinterpreted, and maybe around what Karen says around our discourses, language, and how we talk about stuff. But it's basically saying, it's recognizing the statistical point that I'm interested in, that there's a disproportionality of treatment, right? So if you take, let's say, equal crime events, and the perpetrator in one case is white, the perpetrator in another case is black, all things being equal, there's a very high probability that the black perpetrator will end up either more injured or dead in his or her encounter with the police, or in going through the court system, will have a more stringent sentence or greater problems through the justice system. So it's a very simple claim in saying that Black Lives Matter. Maybe they should have said comma to, T-O-O, after Black Lives Matter, because the common riposte in America is all lives matter, or they show pictures of dogs, and which is incredibly offensive, right? They show a golden retriever saying all lives matter, right? The memes and stuff on Facebook. So I wanted just, if we could talk about this gap between principle and practice, mobilizing to shut that gap, and the politics of the Black Lives Matter movement itself.
Sure, I'll take this one first, because I think it'll allow me to go back to talk about my experience growing up. Because one of the things I think I left with was thinking about this, there's doom and gloom, there was a community kind of fractured, but there was an incredible amount of resistance where I grew up, mainly because people survived. They lived, they made babies, they fought with each other, they fought systems. They continued in some ways to politicize existing in a way that I didn't really get when I was much younger. To recognize that you won't let systems beat you down to the fact that you don't exist to yourself anymore, much less to other people. And that idea of continuing to resist by existing was such a powerful and important message. And it mobilized various different parts of the community for various different political reasons. But I had an amazing education and was able to quote Langston Hughes at like 9, because I just knew these were folks that I knew, these were lives that I recognized as things that were part of my existence, much less this other aspiration. Even though I grew up in an extremely working class poor family, I still was able to quote this poetry and recognize it as an experience that I can actually sort of say, I can say I too am America, right? I can
Yes.
be a part of this world
Yeah.
and interact in it and still demand more from it and recognize its limitations. And in some ways, it's part of my criticism a little bit, I think, to Christopher's comment about white Americans need to be the ones that can recognize this act of resistance, because in some ways I think there's been a continuous process of resisting from people of African descent, a wide range, from those who are born in the U.S., from those in the Caribbean who've come to the U.S. from other places, who've started organizations, who've managed to just be present in spaces where they supposedly are not supposed to be present, and continued by their very existence to lead and to resist. And there's an interesting book that's come out. Well, actually, there's two things. One is John Conyers typically hashtags his when he tweets good trouble almost consistently, and it's an interesting kind of phrase of being good trouble, right? I mean, to sort of sit down. I'm going to occupy the congressional seat. I'm going to occupy this space. And so there's a new book that's come out that's called Necessary Trouble, that actually talks about what happens when you need to mobilize and you need to protest in a particular kind of way to try to trouble particular sets of discourses. And the book actually spends quite a bit of time talking about both the Occupy movement, but also simultaneously the Black Lives Matter movement, or the movement for Black Lives, because it's an umbrella. It's a huge swathe of groups. Some who've been involved in anti-apartheid work, some who've been involved in issues around homeless people, some who've been working with various different trans communities. And so that umbrella is very, very large. And so it's not necessarily just about Black males who have been the victims of state violence. It's a very large umbrella. And what's interesting about it is that it's raised a whole bunch of resistance tactics. It's brought in various different strategies. And the intergenerational sweep is impressive to see, from people very young who've been galvanized to join this movement, all the way to people in their 90s who are seeing something that they're very excited to see, and they're joining, being a part of it. And I think in some ways that necessary trouble is provoking an interesting set of responses to it. Both people who are going, I don't understand, all the way to, this is just nothing new. We did this 50 years ago and I did it. Why are you giving all them any airplay?
Yeah.
And these are people who are on the resistance side.
Sure.
Who are like, this is old news. I'm not interested. All the way to people having fights about strategies. I mean, it's a very interesting moment, much less just the posturing of all lives matter, and I'm going to just resist thinking about why would Black Lives Matter? What would happen if I put that into my mindset? And what would it look like? So there is a challenge, I think, to us to think about, how do we use this moment that has brought a large set of people together? Even, I won't date the show too much, but there's been some issues with one of the presidential candidates about the accusations of sexual impropriety, and instances of accused sexual assault. And those moments have actually generated a whole bunch of responses from a range of different feminist groups who are occupying this movement to sort of talk about rape culture. They're really wanting to talk about the discourse about particular sets of brutality or entitlements. And that's another moment, right? Another moment of what will happen after this, in terms of where will we go, this sort of terrain, how will we start to unpack it? And it's not to get us off of Black Lives Matter, because there are some important intersectional things to start to talk about gender and race together. But it is this sort of idea of, do we take these moments of resistance as moments to just push up a wall and say, I can't deal with what you're presenting to me, or to accuse people of things that they weren't involved in, sort of what's going to end up happening next? Or will the movement end up going into abeyance?
So, I mean, it's interesting to compare them to Occupy, because Occupy had center stage for quite some time. I visited Occupy in Zuccotti Park in Manhattan. I went and spoke to the leaders, and they had this very democratic way of making decisions, which meant it was really hard to make a decision, because everybody had to kind of chant back and forth and talk to each other and come to some sort of conclusion. And yet we saw Occupy movements sort of begin and pop up in California and Oakland, all over the U.S., etc. And then they kind of disappeared for a while, and Black Lives Matter appeared, using similar sorts of strategies of contention, repertoires of contention, I think we call it. So there was a certain mimesis taking place across movements,
or even
right?
the same people.
Or the same people.
These are, people who are fighting these questions about capitalism, or they're fighting these issues about dispossession. They may be working in multiple movements simultaneously, and this is one that just sort of occupies their space for a minute, and then they rise up.
And if we think about human rights, and oftentimes the origins of human rights and the philosophical basis for them remain contested, but there's always an appeal to foundational documents, right? And in the human rights community often talks about the Declaration of Independence of the United States of America as a founding document for discourse around human rights. And actually, if you think about what the colonists were saying, is they were saying no taxation without representation. Now, if that becomes a metaphor for some of the gaps that we're talking about now between the principle and practice of law and human rights and civil rights, etc., what's different about a person in the movement saying, well, actually, I don't feel represented here. I don't feel like I have a say in what's happening. And I feel the disproportionate power of the state bearing down on me. So I should be able to stand up and make a Declaration of Independence, if you will, or an analogical version of that might work and capture hearts and minds.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because throughout American history there are rewritings of the Declaration of Independence by oppressed groups. And we're about to probably elect the first woman president in American history, and in 1848 was the first women's rights convention in not just American history, but world history, that was calling for women's suffrage and many other demands for women's equality. And when they rewrote that all men and women are created equal, they deliberately used Jefferson's language and inserted gender equality in the Declaration, but it's also been used on race and all sorts of other measures. I don't know what I said that there was the slight dissension from, and I'm confused about it myself, but what my intention was to not say that African American voices aren't in the lead on this, but the reverse, which is that, the people who are saying all lives matter and so forth, who are resisting the demands of the Black Lives Matter, tend to be white, and that it's those people that somehow need their consciousness transformed before we're ever going to work out of this problem. The source of white supremacy is within white people, and that responsibility needs to be recognized, and then that's going to take white voices in concert as allies and so forth to be able to transform that, but right now there's just such a long way to go. I do see Occupy and Black Lives Matter as kind of contrapuntal resistance movements of our moment to different forms of equality, which ultimately intersect considerably economic and racial inequality in the United States. And where that goes in the long run, it will be interesting to see. Because we need a concept of human rights that goes beyond the narrow concept of civil rights. It's not just legal or juridical rights or political rights. What we need is housing and jobs and so forth. We need a kind of broad economic agenda. And then we also need specific measures to address racial inequality in its specific forms, side by side with that. Unfortunately, in recent decades, the country's been going in the opposite direction on both. And that's why I think we're starting to see these protest movements erupt. And I do hope that they have policy effects in the next decades.
And I think in some ways they're struggling with some of those originary documents that were inherently flawed, right? And you mentioned from the beginning about my work on Haiti, and Haiti's the second republic in the Americas. It's the first nation that is essentially founded primarily from a slave rebellion, but its foundations is anti-slavery. It's anti-slavery and anti-colonial from its very beginnings, as opposed to the fraught and absolutely tortured, insane reckoning that the United States tries to have for decades with slavery and trying to figure out what the heck it wants to do with it. And so it pretends it doesn't exist or gives it complete cover. And so that you can't have full economic, political, and human rights when your foundational documents have such a fraught relationship with bondage and with a particular set of people. And so that sort of stance is I think generated for a whole set of people a rejection of those documents or a need to rewrite them completely, and actually or reckoning of where their limitations are and not valorizing them in this originalism kind of tokenism kind of approach to it, but recognizing where they started from and recognizing where people need to go to have an actual equitable future. And I think that's a lot of what these movements are grappling with. And actually you see that now with the rise of various different groups that have written certain sets of narratives about U.S. history and certain sets of narratives, especially about white people or what we would categorize as white people within U.S. history, and written a certain set of narratives for everybody else. And that is really quite difficult to sort of try to knock down, because it makes a lot of people uncomfortable, because it makes them have to grapple with the reality of the histories. Forget the ones that are made up, like all of the founding fathers, if we want to call them fathers, being evangelicals, right? The made up histories.
Yeah.
If you have to reckon, and you are struggling with Jefferson owning slaves and making brownish babies with people who he had enslaved, if that is your problem, we've got problems, right? And that took a long time.
Just need an open conversation
for individuals to reckon with Jefferson having that very complicated kind of world.
Yeah.
That's a problem. That's not a question of racist, racism, this is this, that. That's like, this was a reality.
Yes.
People knew that this man had made these babies.
Yeah.
Why in the world could we not even write it in a history book or even have an open conversation? There's your problem, right? Yeah. And I think that's the question of how do we change our discursive terrain and our ability to shape and talk about U.S. history, race relations, interrelations in some capacity that doesn't make people go hide behind a bushel and go, I can't even grasp this. This is too much for my brain to handle. Or go, that was so long ago. We're in this post-racial moment, so let's just not even reckon with it, right? That had nothing to do with me.
Yeah, there's a kind of putting your two fingers in your ears and saying, I can't listen to that because I just can't compute. So I think this sort of final round of discussion really brings everything nicely to a partial close, I would say, because we've had a number of themes across the rights track this year that have really intersected well with what we've talked about here. We've talked about the mutually reinforcing nature of human rights, the interdependence of human rights, that you can't separate out civil and political as one set of rights and economic and social as another, because your exercise of political rights is often dependent upon your level of education or your access to healthcare, etc., and vice versa, that in trying to make demands for social services, you might need to be able to speak freely about that and to assemble freely and to challenge power in ways that BLM is trying to do and that Occupy is trying to do. So that interrelationship between rights is very important. This notion of incompleteness is also interesting to me. So we identify gaps, we mobilize, we try to change things, but history is open-ended in that sense. And the incompleteness of history is what keeps us going and talking about these things. And some people might look back on this year as a year of what political scientists refer to as a critical juncture, right? And we don't know. It's going to take the historian like Christopher Phelps to tell me that this was a critical junction, maybe, 20 years from now, right? But we feel like we're at a moment where the tectonic plates of American history are really shifting. And then unless something's done, it could rip itself apart as a country. The sort of founding principles of democracy are being questioned by Donald Trump at the moment. The founding principles of equality are being challenged by many people, or at least the inequalities that are so apparent to many of us are being made visible, and others just want to put their fingers in their ears and say they don't exist, they don't matter, or that the person who feels that they are suffering from inequality, it's their fault. And I think that by trying to talk about these things more openly, to not hide behind the bushel, as you say, is the first step to that public reckoning. So to bring it back to a truth commission, it might be that a public reckoning is required. I don't know if a truth commission is the right public reckoning, but some sort of huge document. The truth commissions produce these 11-volume outputs. People have a place to go and look. I mean, if you go to the National Archives in Washington, D.C., people go and almost pray in front of the Declaration of Independence. Well, why can't they go and pray in front of a Truth Commission report that actually says your society is really complex, its history is really complex, people are really suffering, and let's go do something about it, right? That's the sort of inspiration that I'd like to take from that kind of moment.
Yeah, this has been a year in which we've all heard the sirens of despair. And we've all felt like if this is what our country's political process is throwing up, it feels ominous, as if some catastrophe is looming, especially if certain people get elected to office. But the long run demographics are that it's a country that's being transformed, and that in the long run it's going to be majority people of color. We're almost seeing the last gasp of people who don't want to let go and have already sensed a decline in their status in that respect.
Yes.
And they're trying to reassert it, but the social history is operating against them. And furthermore, another reason for hope is the younger generation, which is that you see attitudinally in polling, and you see it in the way they vote and so forth, that when they come of age, there's going to be a whole different set of values in operation than we're seeing right now, especially out of one of our major parties, I think.
I think that's a great way. I like to end on hope. It's been a year of talking to lots of people all over the world on this podcast. And one of the themes that's really cut across all the podcasts is that human rights violations are not as bad as we thought they were. And then when people engage in measurement and analysis, they're finding that the trends are slightly more positive than they expect. When they measure public attitudes and opinions across many different countries, people are actually more favorably disposed to human rights than we think. And that's, a good thing. But it also tells me there's a hell of a lot of work to be done, because there are gaps, there are problems, there are misperceptions, misunderstandings, etc. And so for this episode of The Rights Track, I'm very grateful for your participation, Karen and Christopher. It's been a really fascinating discussion. And I'm also delighted to say that we're going to come back for a second series where we're going to talk to practitioners out there working for human rights and ask them about how they use academic research to inform their work and where they see some of the limitations to that work lie, and what they do in their work to make the world a better place. So for this episode of The Rights Track, thank you, Karen. Thank you, Christopher.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This episode of The Rights Track was presented by Todd Landman and produced by Chris Garrington of Research Podcasts. Series 1 of the podcast has been funded by the Nuffield Foundation, and you can find additional information and resources at www.rightstrack.org. Series 2 of the project launches in December 2016 with support from the Economic and Social Research Council.